night was must-see TV, and that was a claim that they could make because they had Friends on, or they had Seinfeld on. Unfortunately, for those in the TV network business, we're no longer in a world where people get to tell consumers what they want to watch, where they want to watch. People with the devices they have, digital devices, are going to watch what they want to watch, when they want to watch. And the challenge is if you try to make something social or real time, how do you do that? And there's some ways that last time I had a discussion with Viacom, they talked about Twitter, and I heard the number, since you're an expert here, Mike, how many tweets happened during the Super Bowl this year?
I don't remember, but it's
number.
Tens of millions.
It was, and that's a way to try to make a community around the event. But it's hard. It's hard to grapple with a radically changed world. So I'd like to give each of you a chance to talk about the radically changing world of media and how you and your companies are dealing with it. Matt, why don't you go first?
Well, I actually think it's tremendously exciting. You know, you can look at any big change, and the world's always changing. You can look at any big change and see threat in it, but almost always there's more opportunity than there is threat. So even though people are watching television differently, they're also watching television differently. They have TV on every device. They have it on their phone, they have it on their iPad, they have it whether on a train or a plane or in their home. And so the availability of television to people is much greater than it was back in the Seinfeld era. I don't know what it was back then, but I'll bet the average number of TVs per household was probably like 1.6 or something like that, and that was the only TV that existed then. So, you know, this is a real opportunity, and people have always been willing, either through advertising or subscription, to pay for content they love. So, you know, I think it's an exciting time.
Yeah, I think the number of opportunities there are, the number of ways there are to reach people is absolutely exciting and new and different. What's one of the challenges and one of the big things that's happening now is the issue of measurement. So our world is actually built behind the scenes on this giant kind of fixed, you know, battleship that's really hard to turn, which is measurement based on Nielsen, which is principally based on a sample of 20,000 households around the country and what those 20,000 people are watching, and advertising, which is transacted on Nielsen ratings. So it's basically the currency of the realm. People buy a certain number of ratings points for a certain amount of dollars, and that's how advertising money changes hands, around $75 billion of it. That system is broken. Particularly in the last year, I think, year or two, the limitations which have long been foretold have really come to bear in the nature of what's happening in the industry.
Are advertisers getting smarter and looking at other metrics than Nielsen to make their decisions then?
Well, remember, these are negotiations. So what are advertisers getting is they're getting free eyeballs. They're reaching those people. They're just not paying for those people because they're not included within the currency.
So in other words, if someone watches a TV show on their iPad later or off a DVR, chances are it's not in the Nielsen rating, and so that's a free one for them.
That's right. So the world began to move as people began to watch on a delayed basis to charging based on the ratings live, and even just, I don't know, 4 years ago or so, that was still largely the transaction. And that moved to something where we get paid pretty much on the commercial ratings, not the program ratings, within 3 days of the original airing. A whole lot of television watching goes on beyond the 3 days. A lot of it goes on without watching commercials, but a lot of it goes on mobile devices which aren't measured at all. It goes on iPads which aren't measured at all, and largely television screens are not measured at all for Nielsen purposes. So one of the pivots that the industry is trying to make right now is how do you transact on other kinds of measures about how effective advertising is. And it involves not just the theory, because actually there's lots of great data out there from set-top boxes and from TiVo boxes and from various other kinds of metrics, but and as well, you know, we're looking at a lot of interesting things. So for example, you know, in some transactions we're getting paid based on how much social media activity is generated by an advertisement. In some transactions we're getting, you know, based on various other kinds of things, as advertising is able to be inserted on the fly in a dynamic way as opposed to in a linear fashion. We'll be able to move more in a world like online where people get paid on transactions and ads can be served up in in a way based on the actual attributes of the person viewing. And these are all the holy grail that we're trying to get to.
Well, let me jump to Lisa then, because I think that is the world you're now in. When people buy the right to use a photograph or an image, it is transaction per transaction. Is that an accurate statement?
I think that's accurate to some extent. And one of the reasons I say that is because we've really had a shift lately in terms of thinking about who our customer base is. And so traditionally, that's exactly the model that we employed, which was we would license, our business is primarily licensing digital content. It's largely photography, some video, and some music. And so traditionally, it was you needed to purchase a license in order to have the rights to use an image. And what we've seen is we were largely B2B, business to business. And so our customer base was somewhat limited, fairly sophisticated, large media companies. And what we've seen in terms of shifts in digital devices and platforms is the availability of so many more people to be a publisher. And that's really shifted our business and our way of thinking. So what we've started doing is looking for frictionless ways that we can actually grant those rights to somebody to use an image. So one of the things that we launched about a year ago is the ability for anybody to take nearly any of our images and embed them for non-commercial use. And that was our way of recognizing that not everybody is a traditional B2B customer where they're going to come to us and license images before they use them. So it was really recognizing that there's this whole untapped potential customer base and thinking differently about that. And these are largely folks who weren't otherwise going to be willing to pay a license. And so what we said was, rather than treating each and every one of those as an unauthorized use, that we could not in a million years be able to police or to put a stop to, it was like playing whack-a-mole. What we could do instead is really think of that as an opportunity for us to build our brand, to build our company's recognition, and really enable folks who weren't going to have licensed the image from us in the first place to be able to use it in a manner that was authorized by us and in exchange gives us some benefits. So we're able to harness the potential of social media sharing and really use it to our advantage. We get important data about where our images are being used, which images are most popular. So there's some quid pro quo there. We also get attribution for our photographers, and like I said, just some name brand building for us.
Do you charge even a nominal amount for that?
We don't.
So if I want to make my homemade greeting card and take one of your images,
It's not available for greeting card use. It's really limited to social media platforms and blogs.
Okay.
So it has to be an HTML environment where you can copy and paste the embed code. And it's limited to non-commercial use. We do draw the line there.
And what if I use it for an Evite? Does that work?
Could you cut and paste it into Evite's platform? Possibly.
Okay.
Possibly.
So this world of new discovery, Jim, I'm going to turn to you because in the film industry, the interview was an interesting moment where we saw the experiment. We got there through a weird way, but the experiment was, what if you tried to release a movie not in theaters, in alternative platforms? So they had like the Xbox release, right? Mm-hmm. And these other. So just to start from a little this in the movies world, what did we learn from that experiment?
I mean, I don't think we learned a lot as a society and as a consumer. I don't know. I looked at that as a unique moment in time and maybe not something that'll get duplicated. I mean, I think when you look at films, the one thing that, although I push Windows all the time and I try to, advantage the company to, get things to consumers quicker, I also think the windowing structure's pretty well defined. I mean, I don't think it's wrong to have people have a window to go to theaters. I think people still enjoy going to theaters. We talk about, pushing that envelope. Why can't you get a movie so soon? Well, if you look at, back to Preston's comment, they're expensive to make. They're not easy, and they're expensive to market. And so we have to be smart about how we window it so that we can maximize. I'm sure if the interview went out in theaters, if it got the same kind of buzz it did and it went out in theaters that same time, I know it would have made more money. So while it may have been convenient, everybody would have wanted to go see that movie, and they would have paid, and they would have gone to the theater. So if you looked at the revenue streams all the way down the line, it would have been a better business dynamic for Sony. It became a unique situation for them.
But I think even with the unique situation, we don't know exactly the but-for world, but we can guess, and I think they made less money because they couldn't release it in theaters.
I think so
Right?
too.
And
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
people have said you could release movies through these non-traditional platforms and give up the traditional legacy platform, and you would be just as well or better off. And people have tried to say that. I think this experiment suggests that's probably not right.
Yeah, that's not.
I don't see anybody in the business saying that.
Outside observers have suggested it. They've
Yeah.
suggested, this is your point, they've suggested something is wrong with windowing, and it's anti-consumer, but the problem is if it's bad business, then few businesses are going to do it. Now, Mark Cuban has talked about this for his studio or whatever. He said he tried to release it both on demand, DVD, and theaters at the same time. And in
Yeah.
theory, they'd be more efficient, but I don't know if that's...
You've seen some little experiments.
Yeah, he does that all the time, but he doesn't have many $100 million movies.
Right.
So, I mean, at the end of the day, we're looking to try to build bigger brands and bigger things, and I think you need to, you need to work within the windows, and then I think you can adjust them. I mean, I look at, you talk about technology and what's happened in the amount of connectivity, and people just want that choice. I mean, I think one of the more unique things that happened to my business in the last year was, quite frankly, Comcast getting into the EST selling movies. When Comcast got into that business of selling
EST
movies,
stands for...
electronic sell-through. So the digital copy, the ability to buy a movie 2 weeks before DVD or 3 weeks before DVD, which happens, was happening regularly on Apple and some of the digital platforms, but not many of the bigger cable platforms or MVPDs that offered it. And Comcast got into it in a very big way. And on some of my movies, within 3 months, they became my number 2 market share. So what businesses can you start from scratch and become number 2 market share within 6 months? Very few. And so I think that really is an example of what that impulse dynamic can be, which is if you give it to them when they want it, and it's legal and it's priced right, they'll take advantage of that. And so I think that's where we can really
That's
spend the
point.
time.
There are opportunities. That's a new window that's become available.
And a new platform.
A new platform.
New platform to do it.
So, Jared, you're a wonderful part of this panel because you grew up, Spotify, in the post-digital broadband world. So you don't have a legacy that your company experienced. Obviously, the record companies and the radio stations are legacy actors. What does the world look like from, call it a digital native perspective?
Sure. I think if you look at the creative industry since the beginning of time, it's actually fairly simple. There are people like who we heard on the other panel who create stuff, and then there's people who distribute them, and maybe there's intermediaries who help one side or the other. And the history of time has been there's been limitations on how well you can distribute their content and how easy it is to create the content. In the music industry in the last few years, we've seen a few shifts. So Apple was able to provide a lot of values to consumers. They essentially disrupted Tower Records. And then we saw Pandora come along, and they essentially disrupt traditional radio. And the reason why those companies disrupted the traditionalists was because they were providing a lot more value to consumers than what the predecessors were. And the value is both in terms of price, it's in terms of convenience, it's in terms of choice. It's very much a similar thing that Amazon did with traditional booksellers. What we've seen at Spotify, and we talked about this on the previous panel a little bit, is what's growing faster than all of those things is what people refer to as piracy. And if you look around the world and you look at consumer behavior, it's true that people shifted from going to Tower Records and Virgin Records to Apple Store. And up until last year, Apple's iTunes Store in music and every other category has been growing at a really, really extraordinary rate. Last year's the first year where they start to see some decline in it. And the reason why they're starting to see a decline is consumers fundamentally want to consume content in a very different way than ever before. And I think one of the advantages that Spotify had is like, hey, we don't actually have a legacy business model that was born of an era where consumers consumed content in a different way. And essentially why Spotify has taken off, to give you a sense, I've been at the company for 4 years. When I joined, we had less than 5 million consumers. We now have more than 50, and we have more than 15 million paying subscribers to our service who are willing to pay $10 a month for the service. And the reason why you have so many people willing to pay for the service is that we believe that what we've been able to do is provide an antidote to piracy. The idea that piracy is free is true. Like, you can go out and find a film, and you can go and find music for free online. It's very easy to do so. But that experience is still a pretty crappy experience because the quality of the film may be bad, the quality of the music may be bad, there's transaction costs associated with finding exactly what you want, and you can't organize, curate, and share that experience in any meaningful way. And so even though piracy has the advantage of being free, it's still not a great consumer value proposition. And by the way, piracy sites can't ever get too big because once they get big, they go on the radar and then they get shut down unless they're in illicit countries. So I think what Spotify has shown is that if you can create a product that consumers love and that matches a behavior that is with where the trends are, shift to mobile, shift to online, shift to digital, and create an experience that's compelling, people would be willing to pay for that experience. And I think the advantage that we have is that we haven't had to rely on old way of measuring our business, whether it's like this form of measuring advertising or that form of measuring advertising. All we have to measure ourselves on is, can we attract consumers and are they willing to pay? And in that respect, it's a slightly more simple business model.
So is all your revenue subscriptions, or do you have some advertising revenue?
So Spotify's business model is we are a freemium service. So we actually make music for free, which is not really free because it's ad supported. And then we use the ad supported service to upsell people into subscriptions. And it turns out, while we haven't publicly announced it, the vast, vast majority of our revenue is subscription, which is actually in stark contrast to every other music service that exists in the world. If you look at the other models for making money in music, it is either buying songs on iTunes, which is still the most predominant form of monetization, or it's ad-supported on YouTube or Pandora. And then the third option, which we are clearly the leaders on, is on a subscription-based model.
So there are a lot of great themes to follow on. Let me just take the piracy one that Jared just introduced. And this is a real existential challenge for the industry. It gets back to Preston's basic challenge. If people stop purchasing content, instead they get it for free in digital form, that will gut the economics of the industry. If there's going to be an industry, they have to be able to monetize the content. And so that begs the question about what is driving piracy, how does it get managed? One question is social norms, because to the extent people believe they have the right to share their HBO to-go code with everyone they know, or the right to go to these sites or make illicit copies, that's going to obviously hurt the industry. One effort to get at this social norm has been this copyright alert system. This came from something that I remember, again, Preston mentioning years ago. When you tell people, we know you're engaging in illegal behavior, you need to stop it, that often is very effective in changing their behavior. Because part of what enables piracy in the internet environment is people thinking, oh, no one knows I'm doing this, so I'm free to do this. Whether that or other efforts, what's your sense about the movement around the industry? We've also maybe want to bring in the question about these ad networks that sometimes do operate on pirate sites, and is that something that's been going down, or ideas of payment processors maybe also being a little more vigilant. Do you see the efforts to stop and redress piracy growing? Are social views on piracy changing? Let me start with Mike, because I know this is something you've focused a lot on.
Yeah, I mean, I think piracy is with us. It's always been with us. It will be with us forever. The question is about how do you manage it. I do think that the efforts that you've talked about have affected the growth rates of piracy. They've been affected by a lot of things, so it's hard to tease out one particular factor over another. I do believe, there have been efforts against advertisers in particular and ad networks. So a lot of the major ad networks are not dealing with flagrant pirate sites any longer. The copyright alert system has had an impact. It's debated how much, so it's hard to dig into the numbers. Part of the problem is that what was originally going to be a notice and consequence system is really a notice and notice system at the moment. There haven't been a lot of consequences yet. Internationally, there's been a lot of progress with blocking of sites that are flagrant pirates. That is something that has not been successful politically here. I thought it was great listening to the artists on the last panel and hearing about their particular issues, but fundamentally this desire to control where their work is going. It's kind of stunning to me in this country how that's been characterized as censorship. An artist controlling their own work somehow is censorship, according to certain advocates. So fighting against that, and then there's the various business models like once you're paying a $10 subscription for music, why bother? But you're talking about businesses that operate on very slim margins. The movie business is on a good day an 8, 9, 10% margin business. So you need a lot of piracy to make it unprofitable.
Unless you've got the Hunger Games, in which case you're doing okay.
I don't know, if you look at the net profit participants, they're still
Yeah, that's right.
We could talk about movie industry accounting,
but I think that the point is that the impact of piracy on the business, whether it's due distribution models or even just simple things like the kinds of movies that are getting created, they're gravitating toward more sure things and away from creatively innovative content. They're migrating to smaller number of releases and various other sorts of things, because as the revenue, particularly from those subsequent windows, declines, it's having a major negative impact on the profitability of the space.
I'm going to come back to that in a minute with Matt, but let me first go to Jim. The movie industry has tried really hard to get beyond the image of like, we're helping Tom Cruise make big salaries, to let people know there are a lot of people who go into making a movie, and it's their livelihoods that are also at risk if you do things like go into the movie theater and tape the movie, because you've heard the statistics how quickly a movie ends up online once it's in the theaters. Are the social norms and other efforts that the industry has been making having an impact on that? What would you say about that, Tom?
I think we have to have multiple fronts. Every single front that we can have, we need to do it. So where I can, there are things that we do periodically to help piracy. One of the things, I'm doing a lot of business these days in China, and that's one where, one of the first things I did is I had a show, Orange is the New Black, on Netflix, and we would always have a 6-month wait before we would launch it in China. So we'd launch it in the US, and 6 months later it'd launch in China. And the piracy that was going on for that show was ridiculous. And it was kind of one of these legacy distribution things. And I said to my team, well, why don't we just go day and date with China? Why don't we just put it up the same day, since they're just going to take it anyway? And sure enough, we experienced some incredible rating, views, because there it's views, and the show's now a hit there. So we have to do things like that. And then the government has started to, because I think there's a lot of focus there on locally produced movies, trying to really become a little bit more thoughtful to copyright protection. I noticed it, the VPNs are probably the biggest issue, I think, in a lot of these situations. And I have some friends of ours that are expats over there, and they were just over to visit recently, and Jeannie was complaining to me that she had her Netflix subscription shut off by the Chinese government. VPNs are being shut down there now. They're actually starting to stop that. And she was just complaining because that's how she got her Netflix, was, how could you do this? And I had to explain to her, well, this is one of the things. So I think that we have to be as diligent as we can, and we have to have as many ways to make people realize that there is harm.
So Matt, we may well be living in the golden age of TV right now, but if the economics are what some people here have suggested they could be, where people just get used to paying less for their video entertainment, that's going to have an impact on what type of programming is available. How real do you see that threat? And again, what are your thoughts on what might be effective in managing piracy?
Well, a couple thoughts. I think there's no silver bullet to piracy. There's no one thing. I think it's a multitude of efforts. I agree with everything Mike said, as usual. I think that, you're always going to have some level of it, and it's been around even before TV. Things have always been stolen and misappropriated. I think in the TV business, it's also very asymmetrical. It hits movies way more than it hits, say, last night's episode of Fallon. So there's a very asymmetrical impact. I think that the behavior that is motivating it is twofold. It's either I don't want to pay the money, I want to get something for free that otherwise I would have to pay for, or it's simply it's not available, like the example in China. So it's not available on my device, it's not available when I want it. And so one way to combat that is really figure out a business model where you can make that content available so that the consumer desire can be satisfied, and that will make new revenue and more revenue, like what's been happening. One example, the Comcast EST, that just came out of nowhere, and it's going to be 9 figures or more. So I think once you can add up all those positives and help provide and solve for the customer need and give them the product they're looking for, you're going to have a lot of positives. The piracy negative is going to be there, and maybe it'll get minimized, and you should do everything you can to fight it. But I think there's a lot of positives, and I actually am bullish that the positives are going to outweigh the negatives.
So Jared, you're living this experiment right now, and this is what you guys are trying to do. To take us a little bit more through it, how do you explain that you're building up these subscriptions for people who might be able to get that same music for free if they were, less law following or whatever, or you gave them less, you guys get a better experience? How do you explain that?
I think simply. So I think it all boils down to the experience, and I think it's something Matt is alluding to in his sector. One of the things that we have a lot of data on at Spotify is just the experience is a better experience than piracy. And you ask, what does that mean? Well, there's a few things. The first is just technologically, if you're looking for a song, you can find it faster, and it will load faster, and the quality of it will be better. So right then and there, it's like, hey, if you actually want a good listening experience, you have it. That's one. The second is we've worked very hard to legally obtain the copyrights to all of the music that we have in the service. So we've got a huge library, 30, 40 million tracks, and that's a lot of music for people to listen to. So there's no reason yet for people to say, I need to go to some other service to find the thing that I'm looking for because it's in there. And then the third is, in a world where you have a lot of choice and there's a lot of content out there and there's a lot of things you can pirate, you may actually not know, and this may be more true of music than it is for film or TV, you actually may not know what you like or want to listen to or discover. And I think there could be value add for services like Spotify to actually introduce you as a consumer to things that you may not know you like. So when I was in high school, you were a punk rocker, you're a country western person, you're a hip hopper, you kind of formed your social identity based around the kind of music you listen to. At Spotify, we have a lot of data, and it turns out that the person who likes R&B also likes country and western music, and they don't really fit in one genre or the other. And the ability to sort of take all the data and listening habits that we have in our system and provide recommendation tools and value-added services make the experience more worthwhile. And then finally, once you nail that core experience and people say, hey, I do prefer this experience to piracy, you can try and scale that by creating certain lock-in effects and network effects for your business. So for example, if you start partnering with hardware companies, so then when you have speakers, Spotify works seamlessly with your speakers, or auto companies, so Spotify's in your car, then you've fundamentally done something that piracy networks can't do, which is created an experience where people want to consume this content when and where they want to do it in a seamless fashion. So if you can nail all those layers, you actually could be providing more value than the alternative.
So Lisa, I admit I know absolutely nothing about piracy in the photograph world. What have you guys learned and experienced on that?
Oh, we don't have any piracy problems. No, actually, I think, like all the rest of the panelists here, we do encounter piracy, and I think our position is somewhat unique and not in a good way, in the sense that everybody's familiar with the right-click function. And so that's what we're competing against, essentially. And unlike some of the other folks whose industries, the pirate sites are hosted elsewhere. You might do a Google search to lead you there. In our case, our biggest challenge is Google image search, which essentially provides you the full image in high resolution. It's exactly the same content that we're providing, and they provide you the right-click functionality as well. So that's a huge challenge for us. And partly the way we're trying to address it is through education, copyright education, trying to stress what the benefits of actually having a license are. We've seen people get in trouble for using an image that they copied in a commercial manner. And it might not be a copyright problem, it might be a publicity rights problem, where somebody who appears in that image then files a lawsuit because they never gave permission for their likeness or their image to be used. So that's one component, is education, like I mentioned, innovation, just trying to find new business models that help us compete on that footing. But it's a real challenge.
If I may make two related points. One point is, one of the challenges with the word piracy is like, who are you actually referring to? Are you referring to my 8-year-old daughter and her friends in like my room upstairs kind of surfing the web and finding stuff and listening to it? Maybe. Are you referring to like me when I was in college hanging out in my fraternity with friends? Maybe. Are you referring to like people with like patches over their eye? Like the thing is, people don't associate themselves with being pirates or doing anything wrong. And I think Matt was getting at a really important point, which is there isn't this one class of people out there who are pirates, who are misappropriating stuff, who are violating laws. There's a lot of different use cases out there. It could be geographical, it could be behavioral, it could be demographics of how people are actually using this content. And so part of the problem with efforts to combat piracy is it's not really speaking to anyone. People don't identify themselves with being the audience who are the recipients of that message. And the second thing related to that is from a consumer perspective, is in today's digital world, consumers are getting a lot of very conflicting signals, and they actually don't know what their attitude should be towards paying for stuff. So for example, right now we're talking about film, we're talking about TV, we're talking about music, we're talking about photos, and the challenge is how do you create a long-term sustainable business model to allow everyone in the ecosystem to get their just dues? The creators, the intermediaries, and the distributors, all of whom feel entitled to some portion of that stack. But if you look at analogous places online, like take maps, for example, why is it the fact that maps are free and you don't pay for maps? Take email. Why is it that email is free and you don't pay for it? Take like instant messaging services. And so consumers are being habituated onto the fact that there's a lot of value that they get from digital services that should be free. Yet there's this other class of things where they wrestle with like, hey, I'm getting more value from Google Maps than I am from whatever, and I don't pay. So why is it the case that I have to pay for X, Y, and Z? And I think the challenge is that the business models in these adjacent spaces haven't caught up with one another, and is confusing consumers, broadly speaking.
It's interesting. My son is 16, and there was a survey that just came out this week from Defy Media, as a company we own a small piece of, where they were looking at 13 to 24-year-olds, and it's approximately 11 hours a week of free online video they watch, and 9 hours of linear kind of TV video. And I think that's one of the challenges we have, is that my son is used to watching other people play Minecraft on YouTube, which I can't get at all, but he seems to enjoy that to the point where he's willing to spend hours doing that, and it's just being conditioned to him that it's free. He makes a click, it's free. And I think, so that's one of the challenges I think all of us have, is to transition that generation to understand that that's not how it's going to work, for the rest of your life, and that there are certain dynamics that you need to understand you will have to pay for. That's an education process I think we're all going to have.
Well, and we're still figuring out what that's done to music. I've heard it said by Aloe Black, among others, that, the amount of money that major songwriters today are getting are not what it was 15 years ago. And one question will be, will that have an adverse impact or not? Another question that I want to pick up on from what Jared said is this data about people watching or consuming content, whatever it is, whether it's pictures or movies or books, then giving you recommendations based on data analytics and algorithms. That's a different world than the old world. So the old world was the world that many of us, in business-wise, Mac, grew up in. You had a bundled set of channels. And you would just stop at the Home and Garden channel and you'd be watching it. And you never would have thought you want to watch it, but it looked interesting. The world that your son's growing up in is the world of data analytics and getting recommendations. Oh, you enjoy watching Minecraft, on YouTube, you might enjoy watching this too. And that's the world that Google is in. That's, Google Maps, they're tracking all your data, so you're going to pay for it one way or the other. What are your thoughts on the transition from the world that we have now in terms of how people get access to content versus this data analytics-driven world? Jared, it sounds like you guys are in this already a little bit. Is there an upside and a downside that you might be able to share?
Sure. First of all, just on the premise, it's not clear to me necessarily that across the board artists are making less money. So for example, if you bought a CD back in the day and it costs $15 retail, what percentage of that is going to the artist, what percentage is going to the intermediaries, and what percentage is going to our records? I think on average, if there was $15 that the consumer is paying, $3 are going to the artist. So it's like somebody here who's good at math, I think that's like roughly 20%. It's not a big chunk of the $15 retail price is going to artists, but artists also suffer from another problem, which is how do they get discovered? And fewer artists get discovered in that world. So it's not clear to me that artists were better off in that world. One of the advantages in today's world is that there is an opportunity for more artists to be discovered, broadly speaking, and to build a career out of creating stuff. And the question is, and so that's a really terrific thing. And I think we're seeing actually an explosion in the music space in terms of how much content is being created and also how much content is being consumed. The challenge is not comparing today's model to yesterday's model. The challenge is how do you ensure that in today's model going forward, you've struck the right balance so that artists do feel incentivized to continue doing this, which I think they would, frankly, regardless of these issues we're talking about. But more importantly, how do they feel like they're actually getting paid a fair compensation for their work? And I think no one has nailed the answer to that. And part of it is because there's a lot of legacy business models that are built on the backs of there being an imbalance between artists, intermediaries, and distributors. That will shake out over time, though.
Let's go to TV. The economics of music production, I think, are qualitatively different than TV.
Definitely.
And so there, people having the revenue flow, as well as people being able to figure out about what shows are out there, can help make or break what gets done. What do you guys see coming in that regard?
In terms of the production side?
Production side, and then just how people discover TV shows. Because there's some forces at work now that are going to change whether shows get made, whether shows continue to be available. I mean, people said Seinfeld would never have made it in today's environment because if it didn't pick up an audience quick enough, you guys would have to yank it. What sorts of those changes do you think are happening or likely to happen?
Well, I think certainly the costs of making good TV are not going down. So it's very expensive to make good TV, and that is, I think, a qualitative difference to music. And it's true of movies as well. The cost of making movies is not going down. So the front end of the system, which is the actual content production or the rights acquisition, is all just as expensive or more expensive than it has been. All the distribution pieces are changing with the advent of technology. I think that all the discovery tools that are out there, I think first off it's great for consumers. I think you could say that could have had one of two effects. It could have caused this flight to quality where everybody just goes and watches the same thing, but that isn't what happened. What's really happening is there's been this real, I think, fragmentation, I suppose, in people's viewing habits. People's favorite, I guess I can share the example from, we had a lunch, Dean set up a lunch that I was at earlier, and we went around the room and asked everybody's favorite TV show, and it was essentially all different. And some of the favorite TV shows were from 10 years ago. So what's been happening, I think, in the world is people are actually watching a lot more different kinds of TV shows, and they're actually more satisfied than if they were all kind of funneled into just a few choices. But all that being said, the money is going to have to come into the front end of the system in order to pay the writers and the electricians and the makeup artists and the talent and, for the big sound stages and for the camera crews. I mean, it's just an enormously complicated and expensive process. And then in the case of sports, you have all of that plus the rights fees, which are sizable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think in television, you are seeing the fact that, except for sports, people are able to watch what they want to watch when they want to watch it, right? So sports becomes incredibly valuable for advertisers who are trying to reach people at a particular point in time. And they've also been aggregated in a way that allows them to then be on-sold to cable operators at a point in time when they have a lot of leverage. And those two things have resulted in a tremendous amount of money flowing towards sports rights fees. And then you get to the kind of rest of television. And there, too, this fact that people can watch what they want to watch has kind of swept up the dollars into this lots of very high value, high production value, very expensive television, which is driving, the particular cable networks. AMC has been enormously successful with television shows like The Walking Dead. So what used to be money that was spread out across a whole television schedule has now been kind of concentrated into a small number of really high quality shows, because that's what people are going to watch. There's less time being devoted to kind of the rest of the schedule and more time being devoted to kind of the best stuff that's out there. So the long tail is there. I actually think the value chain has moved in the opposite direction towards the higher value content.
Yeah, I think, and the bigger challenge is, just being able to get the audience now. I was looking at the volume for my international staff. It's 3 times as many TV shows are being produced that are being distributed internationally than there were 3 or 4 years ago. It's tripled, because every single cable network is trying to do originals to break out. I mean, I look at Mad Men, which is our show, which is ending on AMC this next month, and I don't know how we would launch that today. You know what I mean? I think it would be a tougher show on AMC to launch that today. I think, when we have strategic meetings about how to do this, one of the things we're doing now is we're doubling and tripling our marketing budgets to help the networks with every single one of our movie dynamic. Like, if we can use other audiences from our platform to help a show out, we have to do that, because there's just so much white noise out there. It's just very difficult to break through.
Also, to that point, to your question about discovery, I think people have grown more distrustful of traditional advertising and more trustful of social media and various other kinds of alternative sources that aren't directly coming from marketers. And so that means that marketers have to get more sophisticated, but a lot of show discovery is a sort of word of mouth. It's happening in social media. It's happening in traditional media that's getting retransmitted through social media. It's about starting a conversation around a television show. Often people are finding shows kind of late, and you're trying to serve them up the things that they missed so that they can kind of do this catch up to the conversation. So a lot of that is happening.
Well, those are 2 areas Matt said before that Netflix has come in, which is these shows that you have to watch in order. Netflix has a really good value proposition offering. So if you discover Mad Men late, you either have to buy the DVDs or you probably watch them on Netflix or Amazon Prime, and you can just catch up. The other one Netflix has done really well with is documentaries or niche shows, where they can figure out you like them and then they can have them for you.
Yeah, the traditional cable world is catching up with that. I mean, partly because we have so many people to negotiate with, it takes longer. Mm-hmm. But video on demand services now have catch up, and particularly where something's serialized, they often have catch up of a whole season or even the whole from season 1. So if you like a show on Showtime, typically on your cable system, all the shows from the beginning of time.
Both on demand to catch up and Netflix? Is it on both platforms?
It is. It's limited a little bit on AMC, but for the most part, it's on both.
Would it be fair, the current year is probably on video on demand? And
Yes.
back,
Not on Netflix.
and
Right.
back seasons.
Yep.
So it's split in that way.
Right, so that's a value proposition for the consumer, actually, where you can watch the current season now on cable,
Right.
and pay your Netflix subscription, and you get to kind of watch the whole backstory. And so that's another way to engage with the consumer, because it's all available. But the other thing that's happening finally is something called TV Everywhere authentication, where there are a lot of online and on-demand applications that are available over IP. So if you have a cable subscription, you can watch your cable subscription
Over
on
your
those other
VPN
devices.
connection in China, apparently.
Yeah.
Apparently so.
Or not.
Apparently so.
So Lisa, in the photography world, have the economics looked more like music or more like TV shows? I mean, is it gotten more expensive as equipment's getting more expensive to take really high quality photographs, or is it actually democratized that anyone can do it and be a photojournalist?
I'd say there's probably more of the latter trend going on, especially with iPhone cameras and, everybody can take pictures. But, there's still that market for professional, higher quality photos. We actually have two sites. One is the more premium content, and we have a lot of partners. So we work with National Geographic, BBC distributes footage through us, Major League Baseball, those kinds of partners, and that's always going to be the premium content. That's stuff that not everybody else can replicate, so there is still a market for that. Then we also have a site called iStock Photo, and that's a much more democratic kind of experience where, you could be a contributor. You just have to have photos that we think are sellable or licensable, and you'll find more of a mix there. But we do still see the market for the high quality, even though there is more opportunity there, I think, for folks with your iPhone cameras.
Let's go to questions from the audience, and we have what Paul Ohm has dubbed the Weiser rule, which I will happily own, which is we start with a student or two, not afraid to call on folks either. So, all right, Bill.
Thanks. Have content creators been pushing for different types of compensation to kind of offset the no-charge distribution models that are arising?
Types of
Content
compensation.
creators,
the
so
question.
let me give a premise, which is how much market power do the content creators have to actually push for compensation? And Jared, you're going to get this question eventually, so I'll say. Taylor Swift has about as much market power now as probably any artist. She apparently didn't want to be on Spotify because she thought the compensation model didn't work there. Is that sort of just an atypical thing, or is Bill suggesting are artists going to exercise or try to exercise more control to, ask for things a certain way?
Look, everybody in the value chain needs to get value from the chain. And I think, like, if you look at music, for example, there are literally a handful of artists who are really just so powerful that they can dictate the terms of everything they want to do. Taylor Swift is an incredible artist, and she has a huge audience. So she has transcended, she doesn't need her intermediaries. She doesn't necessarily need certain distributors because she's in a luxury position of being able to control how she wants things distributed. I think, one of the lessons that we discussed in the last panel, which is that most artists aren't in that position. They're in the position that they actually want a lot of distribution, and the marginal amount of money that they're going to make is still helpful to them because they can recoup it both directly through subscription fees, but also through helping promote tours and ancillary revenue streams. So I think what we're seeing is, for the vast majority of artists, it's really a great model. There are a few who it's less good of a model for. So for example, like if you take Taylor Swift, why is it that she still appears on YouTube but doesn't appear on Spotify? Is it that YouTube is paying her more money than Spotify was willing to pay her? And I think the answer is very likely no. That is not the reason. I think the reason is because YouTube has 1 billion people and Spotify has 50 million people. And to her, the value of having her music for free in front of 1 billion people is a value that she gets from that experience, which is why she does it. Look, artists want to get paid more money, period, the end. They have always wanted to get paid more money, and there's never been a model ever in the history of music that has compensated artists in a way that I think artists think is fair, and frankly at Spotify that we think is fair for artists. But for all the reasons that we've alluded to but haven't expressly stated on this panel, there are many players in the value chain who all want to extract their rents from the process. And every time somebody takes $1, there's the $15 in the CDs. I told you $3 went to artists. So where's all that other money going to? It's not to the artist. And so the question is, why is that, and should it be the case? And I think we're now starting to have like a conversation in the industry about where that line should actually be.
Yeah, in the movie and television business, it's a very different answer. Because while in music, a lot of these rights are valued by tribunals, for example, and rate courts and performance rights and various kinds of copyright tribunals. In our business, it's really a free market. And so for most artists, they're negotiating what their value is. And somebody's trying to put together a project is deciding whether they can get a return or not, and whether or not that artist is adding enough value to the project that they're worth what they are quoting as a fee.
I was going to ask Jim that question. It seems to me, this is just total casual observation, less emphasis on star-driven vehicles today than 10 years ago. Is that an accurate observation? Or
No.
Not necessarily?
No.
Okay.
I think there's just as many star-driven vehicles. I think we do have those discussions all the time where we have talent coming in with different demands. And as projects get going, it's amazing how that market works. I've been involved more in the inner workings lately, and X wants X million and X wants Y, and I want a piece of gross. All those dynamics go on, and it's a constant battle. I think one of the things we have to do, I think pretty much everybody here have to do on this panel, is we have to be really good at what we do. Because we have to show to whether it's a musician or an actor or a producer that, or even a photographer, that we can distribute it better than they can on their own. Because one of the things that's changing is that there's a lot of ways for artists to do these kinds of things on their own. So we take a lot of time and effort to make sure that we can show that you just can't do what we do on your own. And that's a big deal.
I think in the TV business too, the definition of a star is different. It doesn't necessarily mean the person on the screen. If somebody's coming to you with a TV show idea, Vince Gilligan's the star, right? He's the guy that produced Breaking Bad, and
Or
so
J.J. Abrams.
David
exactly,
Fincher, right.
or whoever, Mark Burnett. So most times in the TV business, it's really more about that, who's bringing you the project. And if you have a hot project or a hot producer, hot director, whatever, there's going to be a lot of competition among all the network groups for that project. And then, of course, there's going to be a lot of projects that are just trying to get discovered and somebody takes a chance on, and they don't have any market power. So, as Mike said, it runs the gamut, and it is utterly a free market.
And then I would add one other thing, which is that in our business, a lot of the talent are represented by unions. And so there are aggregations of market power that result in a certain amount of residuals and various other kinds of terms that are available. So unlike the music industry, for example, writers and directors and various others are represented by trade guilds.
So Annie, one more student, and we'll go to others.
Yeah, I'm curious. You guys talk a lot about data and what you guys have to offer, and you guys are getting all of this different information. But as privacy becomes such a big concern, I'm wondering how you guys deal with that in terms of innovation, and if that causes any boundaries or limitations or obstacles.
So when people know what you're consuming, how you're consuming, when is privacy limitation? Lisa, do you want to start with
I can speak to that a little bit. We're not so much interested in who you are and which images you find compelling. We're interested more in trends and data on an aggregate level. So we're not tracking it by individual based on personally identifiable information. We're really looking at general trends. And demographics are of interest as well. I mean, if we know that you're a typical type of consumer and you like these images, and then you also like those images, and we can make those associations and those trends, that's of value to us. And that helps our partners know what type of content they should focus or their investments on creating.
So I think one of the fears is if you know two things about somebody, what type of music they listen to or photographs they watch that might be associated with something bad about them, how does that inference stop from getting made and used to someone's detriment?
Well, look, I'd say one thing, which is people are going to need to kind of get used to the idea that there's a huge amount of data about them that has been collected and is being collected by companies, particularly for advertising purposes, right? Other purposes too, but particularly for advertising purposes. Advertisers want to know if they're marketing to particular people. And nothing is really done, or very little is really done by most companies that really try to tie that to any individual for a reason. right? So there's some IP address out there, and they know like 8, dimensions of characteristics about that person. There's an advertiser who wants to reach somebody with those 8 characteristics, and an ad gets served up. And that's the fundamental economic force that's driving all those free services. And so that's why you see, for example, tech companies in particular fighting back against a lot of the things that are kind of being done in the privacy area, because that actually is that engine of economics. With respect to the more specifics, our companies go to at least our company, I think most companies go to a lot of lengths to make sure that we are actually very protective. We're not, the individual information is not traveling around the company in any way other than in an aggregated fashion. Nielsen is not trading on data about any particular individuals. They're trading on aggregated information that doesn't tie back to a particular individual. We're very protective, as we all have to be, because of a variety of legal requirements, but also because we have really no reason to try to behave any other way.
Yeah, I think every big company has a very strict privacy policy, and to your point, all this is done algorithmically. So no one is sitting there saying, let's figure out what's going on in Jim Packer's household, and there's not another human being that's saying, I really am interested in knowing this. It's done by these computer programs, and it's done based on a set of specifics that just zip an ad in there, and no one's looking at it in a voyeuristic way.
Yeah, I think also one of the things that's tricky for those of us that create content is that, when we do business with Matt's networks and Mike's networks, we know the date, we know the shows that go on. We know through Nielsen who's watching those shows. We can then tailor our marketing campaigns for downstream revenue for that. The new players like Netflix really don't share data very much. So on Orange is the New Black, which is a big show of ours, I don't get data. And that is a big challenge for a lot of my ancillary revenue streams. And it's kind of one of the things that I think technology companies are very protective about, that data. And yet for the ecosystem, when profit participants come and they want to know how is our show doing and can you tell me how I'm doing so I can renegotiate, we can't give them any data points. And so it's a very unique dynamic that's changing.
Which is why Netflix doesn't want to share it with you.
Which is why they don't want to share it with you, exactly.
Right up front here.
Thank you all for being here. This is amazing. So I'm curious, we heard on the panel before that artists, whether they're photographers or musicians or motion picture celebrities, want to make more money, and you're hearing that too. So what are you seeing? Well, the industry is seeing that these celebrities or Netflix stars or musicians or photographers are taking their personal influence, so they're a Netflix star, so now they have 1 million followers on Twitter or Pinterest or Instagram or Vine, and they're now generating streams of revenue from their personal influence, but that's still content creation. And so Coca-Cola is going to pay somebody on Vine, might pay a millennial on Vine, tens of thousands of dollars for a 6-second video. So my question is, what's your take on that? Do you care about that? Do you encourage that because your artists are making more money, or is that stealing dollars from Coca-Cola that they're paying a Viner that they could be paying to advertise on your show?
That's a very good question. I think all of us are trying to make more money. So just let's be clear. I think everybody is trying to make more money. I give them credit for that. I think, one of the things we're doing now is we're looking at that also to market our content. We talked a minute ago about how we get our content out there and how does it become buzzworthy. That's one of those new opportunities for us to go to an influencer and try to get them to influence and get somebody to sample a show. The other thing we're doing, we just did a deal on a movie called the Smosh movie. We're going to some of that talent and trying to make content with them and then have them energize their base to get that to become a decent business. So in some ways, yes, everybody's going to look to monetize, but in some ways it'll open up some opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, these are new media businesses. I think it's fantastic that some of these new ideas are being generated and that people are figuring out new ways to reach audiences. And I think as they aggregate audiences, they become valuable talent. And hopefully the much bigger platforms that we represent will be able to take advantage of that and work with them.
I mean, that's part of the new world we're in. And one way to think about it is every single person in whatever industry you're in, but here the creative industries, is an entrepreneur in themselves. In effect, they're responsible for building their own franchise. The old world was the studio system would buy you, and they would own you. right? That was the old world.
That was before me.
There you go.
Before all of us.
We're now in a very different world, and if you get to be as successful as Taylor Swift, then you're really dictating terms. But even others are finding a way to build their own brands. If they've got a lot of followers on Twitter, that's a value proposition they can use. Right back here.
Thank you. So there's the trope that content is king, and I wonder how true that is. Even using the word content and the way we talk about it suggests that it's almost a widget that you can plug into your distribution and revenue model, and out pops whatever pops out. So, I mean, not personally, but from your own business models, probably also, particularly Getty and Spotify, but the rest of you, to what extent is content fungible?
Well, let me jump into that. I've always thought, well, partly because our chairman is credited with having said it, that content is king. Distributions clearly has a seat at the table. If you can come up with a better word than content, by the way, that's worth a lot, because it really is a generic term around something. Movies are wonderful because of how they make you feel. Calling them content is demeaning, right? But at the end of the day, what we're talking about in the abstract is the fact that it's those experiences that people want to participate in that are why they're buying phones, and why they're going to the movies, and why they're going to art museums and looking at photography. At the end of the day, nobody's turning on Spotify to listen to white noise. They're turning on Spotify because they love music. And so all of these devices have to be in service of delivering experiences to people that they want to experience.
Although you would be surprised at how popular white noise is.
All right, and back here.
And I would say there's a lot of content, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's fungible. And we would just as often refer to photographs as we would content. So I don't see the use of that term as denoting a qualitative change in what it is that we're talking about, which is really an individual photograph or a work of art.
I agree with what's being said. On the other hand, if you look at distribution, just broadly speaking, what tends to happen from cycle to cycle is that there's distributors who grow from economies of scale and network effects and almost become either actual monopolists, natural monopolists, or quasi-monopolists who exert a lot of power. And if we look at the kind of shift that we see in the world, if you look at like the scale of YouTube, for example, it's extraordinarily powerful, and people are willing to be, YouTube's able to do a lot of things to disrupt traditional content businesses. It's able to sort of create new forms of content that people really like and create really valuable monetization models for those. But on the other hand, create really profound challenges for the way in which content used to be monetized. And so, I don't know, content still is extraordinarily important because that's what people are going for, but at a certain level of scale, the power of, for example, YouTube scale is so great that that's very powerful.
Distribution management. But let me make one other observation, which is that I think the distinction between content and distribution is disappearing. And I think to the extent that we were talking about it when those words were coined 25 years ago, we were talking about hardware and software. And that's all changed now because distribution is software too. And where does YouTube stop being a distribution system and start being an experience of its own? Where does Spotify and all these other things that Spotify's doing for you become part of the overall experience? Those lines are much more blurred than I think they were before. It used to be a television show or a movie delivered over a pipe, and that's nowhere near the case anymore.
So last question.
Could you offer some suggestions on workable parameters for protecting consumers from information being used against them? And I'll give you an example. My father-in-law was an art historian, teaching assistant at Columbia University in the late 60s. He was photographing in Berlin. He was an architectural historian, accidentally photographed Stasi headquarters and other areas. He was imprisoned for 9 months. They told him there was a lot of information against him to get him to confess as a spy. And it was really 30 years and only because of a change in German laws that he was allowed to see the records against him. And so this information which was collected was misconstrued. My father had the same situation in Cuba. Some stuff was printed, he was imprisoned, it wasn't true, he got out. But I have a concern here that we're relying on benevolence. We're gathering content, and we can triangulate it. It's not enough to say it's a generic IP address and user account. We know it can be triangulated. So I'm concerned about specific laws that protect U.S. citizens from information being used against them.
So let me give you a concrete version. I had a thought just like Carmen's. If you're in a country, pick a repressive regime of your choice, where some of your services are available, and they can know by the music you listen to or by the shows you watch or the photographs you look at that you're likely to be a dissident. If the regime can get that information, either indirectly, if they're observing networks, or directly from someone who is forced to give it up, that is problematic. Have you thought about those issues and what can be done?
Other than to be horrified? I could say we don't do that. If somebody prohibited us from doing that, it wouldn't bother us. But I don't know, offhand as I sit here now, I haven't spent enough time thinking about those problems about how you prevent, the East Germans or the North Koreans from doing that.
I mean, how much can Viacom do to affect? You know what I mean? There's only so much that private businesses can do. I mean, we all have very stringent privacy policies. We have no reason to do it. You really don't see those kind of abuses. If some of these countries are able to, through their own internet spying mechanisms, able to figure out what people are watching, I don't know how we can affect that.
Well,
it's
and
terrible.
and that, by the way,
It's
just to
terrible.
give Jim the other side, some people said the bad thing about the China cracking down on VPNs is because they want to do exactly this. And the VPNs were a loophole that gave people freedom. So these issues are complicated.
Well, let me say one, on that, we've been trying to, obviously we feel very strongly that our companies are entitled to determine how our content is exploited, right? And artists are entitled. And so we've been fighting this battle against piracy for a long time as it's turned electronic. One of the arguments that you've been used against people who are trying to fight piracy is a quite real concern about privacy and the extent to which this desire to engage in legitimate law enforcement interferes with a concern that people have that their private activities are going to be observed. And we do see, the kinds of issues that you're talking about crop up in the dialogue a lot. I mean, in Russia, for example, they have a very strong site blocking legislation around copyright. I don't think anybody believes that the reason why Russia was one of the first to have a site blocking legislation was because they cared a lot about copyright, right? So I think these issues get tied up in one another in a way that hurts our ability to pursue legitimate objectives because of that.
So for those who have their appetites whetted, we'll have our next year's privacy conference to visit these sorts of questions. For now, let me thank the panel for a wonderful discussion. Thank you. Okay.
We'll take a break, and I'll see you guys back at 4 o'clock. Thank you.
It's fun, Jim. Good to see you in this conference.